national average yield of winter barley is probably something in the region of 3.3 to 3.5 tonnes per acre. Whereas winter barley after a break crop, it's almost like a different crop in terms of its yield potential. And I've seen it in many years, winter barley touching 5 tonne an acre when grown after a break crop with less nitrogen input. That's something that we need to think more about, I think, putting winter barley into a continuous cereal situation.
Christmas is approaching quickly, and many of us are turning our attention to celebrating the year gone by. It's easy to recall the standout events, but often harder to reflect on the trends that have shaped the farming calendar. Looking back in the farming year, what are the key learnings you'll carry forward? You're listening to the latest episode of the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. We would really appreciate it if you could listen, follow and give us a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts from. There's something to be learned every year, but it can take a bit of reflection to pinpoint exactly what that is on your farm. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Richie Hackett, an independent agricultural consultant based in Dublin, and John Dunne, the cereals variety manager in Goldcrop in Cork, to discuss the year gone by. Richard, every year has its own unique weather patterns. You might maybe assess what the weather brought for us in 2025.
So there's two stories from it. I suppose from an agronomy point of view, it was around this part of the country. It was a fantastic year. We had crops were sown in very good conditions last back end. And with this predominantly winter cereal area, we don't generally focus on spring crops at all, apart from vegetables and potatoes, we'd say. So the focus around here is on winter cropping. So the winter crops went in very good conditions. They had a very mild winter and they came out the winter very strong. Then it dried up in February, and I was just looking at rain gauge figures that I would have, and anytime they needed water, they got water. They got plenty of heat earlier on. And the missing factor in 2024 was temperature, soil temperature. But the soil temperature built up very early in the soil around here, and it continued for the whole year. And anytime we wanted water, we got water. And anytime we wanted it dry, we got dry. And so we had a really, really good year from a growing point of view. Didn't make any money out of it though, which is the issue at the end of the day. But if your business was to look at grain and look at grain coming in across weighbridges early in the season in good order, and look at straw going across out of the fields in good order, it was a fantastic year.
Yeah, a bit of a Goldilocks type scenario.
Exactly, yes. Yeah,
and John, further south then with yourselves, did you experience something fairly similar enough?
I suppose I was a little bit envious during the autumn of anybody probably north of Tipperary. Anybody along through Cork, Waterford into Wexford. We actually had quite a wet beginning to the autumn. October wasn't a whole pile of use, and we were seeing people in the northeast finished walking around fields in their shoes, whereas down here we were sitting on our hands until the very end of October, and it was actually November when we got planting cereals down here. And I suppose even outside of cereals, oilseed rape was tricky to get into the ground as well, because we had a late harvest in the harvest of that year was late finishing, so oilseed rape sowings were back. So yeah, it probably wasn't as smooth as further up the country. Now, when we got into the spring, January, February were wet, but March turned very, very dry. We were down probably about 50% of our regular rainfall in March, and that got things going in terms of beans and some spring cereals. And the year progressed on. It was probably a year of extremes, really, in terms of dry. We had a couple of very dry months there, which took their toll in some instances. But on the other hand, we had a lot of solar radiation, which is probably what saved our day. We had some very good yields in some crops, depending whether they had enough water at any given time or not. But it wasn't a terrible year down here. There was some excellent yields and there was some disappointing yields, but the harvest weather was very helpful as well, and we got crops cut in very good conditions. So
okay, John mentioned there was a couple of dry months there starting off. Was it that bit drier for yourselves up there, February, March bit, and were farmers able to take advantage of that?
Yeah, I'm just looking at the again. I haven't got a proper rain gauge on, but I'm just looking at that. I only measured 5 mil of rain in March. And there was only there was only 2 mil in the 7th of March, and there was in the 26th, 27th there was another 3 mil. So we had a very, very dry March, but it was the ideal time. Soil temperatures at that time were building up, so lads got going, and particularly in potatoes. And I think that there was a story there actually. There was they got going early. Any spring crops that were sown in really good conditions. Got going. I think moisture deficit would have kicked in the spring crops I always say that if we had a wet year, generally the spring crops will save the northeast. And this year, it's a good job we had the winter crops. The spring crops didn't perform because they had moisture deficits at particular times. They didn't perform, and I wouldn't have liked to be dependent on them, like we would have say the year before, where they did fantastic and they did really well.
And even the fact, Richie, they were sown relatively early, that still didn't save them. Was
And
it
I mean,
too dry or what?
There was times that if you look at over the season, we were getting blocks of dry and blocks of wet and blocks of dry, and depending where your crop was, if your crop was in a rapid growth phase and needed moisture, it suffered. It didn't tiller out well, and particularly would have seen say crops of spring wheat that were a little bit late when they just ran through the stages. But if you got them in early and got it going, got a good tillering, they were fine, did perform really well, and some of us had some fantastic area, but it just when you're in reasonably heavy soils around here, you're really dependent on a little droppy weather for the whole season, where you get a bit of water all the time. And it depends where your crop is. If you have a burst of a couple number of weeks where it's dry, your crop can suffer. If you want moisture during that kind of time, and we kind of would have saw that in say spring barley crops that tend to run through the growth stages at this point in time. The varieties just cannot take that kind of abuse. Where they used to be able to wait, but they can't wait now. They just run through their phases. And, whereas potatoes could wait, and potatoes did really, really well in crops, as the season went on.
And John, you mentioned there was some modest enough kind of yields as well. Was that to do again with the very dry start off kind of phase of it? And
I suppose Richie described it well there. We were getting blocks of weather. So we were getting, March was really dry, then we got rain in April, and then it turned really dry again in May. So depending on how a crop had been treated, and I suppose let's just pick spring barley as an example. If your spring barley had gone in at a reasonable time in March, perhaps, importantly, if it had got a good lot of fertilizer in the seed bed, it was probably fine. But if it was sown a bit late and didn't get any nitrogen in the seed bed, it really suffered. And there was those extremes were there. Like there was spring barley in the good situation touching 4 ton an acre in places, whereas the other extreme could have been 2.5 ton an acre. And it was down to luck in many cases, just depending where you were and if you got rain at the right times. So if there was any lesson to be learned from this year, fertilizer in the seedbed for spring barley is ultra important in my book. And I don't think you could put too much of it into the seedbed.
And John, speaking of that, was there, given the fact that March was so dry, was there any more use of organic manures used in the spring crops?
Not particularly, Michael. It wouldn't be widespread down here, despite having lots of livestock. The amount of slurry going on to arable crops down here wouldn't be huge. So it was no greater than any other year, in my opinion.
And then maybe moving on, John, just in terms of diseases, maybe some of the earlier diseases. I know we had a bit of a change this year in terms of winter wheat diseases.
Yeah, so the yellow rust was probably the story of the season. It cropped up in the northeast of England initially. And it wasn't too long before it made its way over here. And I think the first bit of it I found was at the end of April, around the 27th of April, it cropped up down here. And we had quite an extended spell of easterly wind, which probably moved the spores across. And as Richie highlighted, we had dry weather as well, which suited the disease to a fair degree. And that was cropping up for the rest of the season, really, depending where you were. It would be rare down here for it to happen, but it did happen down here. Whereas further up the country, it would be more common. So that was one disease. And I suppose another thing that cropped up later in the year, particularly in winter wheat and also in spring wheat to some degree, was barley yellow dwarf virus. That showed itself in winter wheat as the crops were finishing. And that was a little bit disappointing for people because we didn't really know it was there until that point. So they were the two diseases that come to my mind.
And Richie, can I go back to you and as John mentioned, the yellow rust there, which probably was generally more prevalent up around the northeast. Was that well controlled, or did that come through an impact on yields in any crops towards the end?
I think it's fairly well controlled. I mean, I think the thing with yellow rust is once you start getting it, it's just going to cost you a lot of money, and once you're on it, your disease program has started, and you then have to keep going. And I think again, it did break out. We haven't got the variety selection at the minute, and that's just the way things are at the minute. But it did, because we saw few varieties. One variety started breaking down. It did really run rampant. But we kind of sat on top of it. It's hard to know what damage yellow rust really does. There's a lot more damage than we really see, because you see it and you kind of cure it, and then throws another leaf and you kind of hide it. But you would wonder what impact it's having. I do think it does have a fair bit of impact. What I did find is that I would have thought around April or into May we were in for a really high septoria pressure, and that didn't manifest itself at all. I mean, it was. I remember 1997. I was the first year I was working in Lion State, so I kind of remember that year, and it was a really, really early year. Started really well and very thick growth, and it was fantastic. This exactly was the very same. That year we got an awful lot of septoria, and at the time we could control it relatively easily. Now we can't. And I was really concerned. I'm just looking again at the rain gauge. Towards the end of May, the weather did break, and we had trouble trying to get the flag leaf sprays out. And I was getting really concerned. But as a problem, it didn't arise. There was very little disease pressure. I think the yellow rust didn't really seem to, for what the damage we thought it would have done, because we haven't got a really, really pressurised year. My view, yellow rust is it's a weather disease. The weather changes, it'll disappear, and the weather keeps forward, it'll change, it'll stay there, nearly regardless of what you do. But it just seemed to grow all. There was some disease. I would have said I was very happy with the control of disease we would have had this year, particularly in winter series.
And John, moving on through the year, kind of coming up towards harvest, if you remember back then, harvest probably started 10 days earlier than normal. I'm not sure down in Cork, but certainly around here it certainly does. You might maybe just give us a reminder on the conditions around then. And you mentioned already something about, we got lots of solar radiation, but then we were short of 10 days.
It's true. It started. We were cutting spring barley down here in the last days of July, which is at least it's probably closer to 2 weeks ahead of normal for us. And it was temperature driven primarily, as far as I can see. Like I remember looking at average temperatures for most of the met stations around the country, and right from October to June inclusive, with January being the only month not abiding to this, but every other month was probably in the region of 10 to 15% warmer than normal, except for January. And that drove growth. And as you say, we were short of growing days. And I suppose any data that we've ever seen, it would always indicate that every day extra of grain fill turns into yield. So when you're cut short by almost 2 weeks, you have reason to be concerned. But I think the solar radiation there, particularly in April and May, and also in July to a degree, seemed to be substantially ahead of recent years, and that's probably what helped us. And that was great, and an early harvest is usually a good thing. But as I said, where crops didn't have issues, drought issues, or disease issues, there was some fantastic yields. And one crop that comes to mind is oilseed rape. Oilseed rape probably had the best year that it's ever had in Ireland. And if you look back to as I mentioned, the high sunshine months were March, in particular, and April, and that was wonderful for flowering and pollination. And May was very dry. Like I was looking at the Met Éireann figures for May. Roach's Point, which is my local station, was 30% of normal, and Johnstone Castle was 35% of normal. So things got very dry in an important month. But look, things came through, and I think it was sunshine levels helped us a lot.
So Richie, John is after saying there a second ago that oilseed rape seems to be his standout crop for the year. What was yours?
Very definitely was oilseed rape. Yeah, kind of needed it. It needed it because it was beginning to. We're losing the love of it, and it's getting. It's fine. Keeping it slot in a rotation was beginning to become questioned. So I think I had a really, really good year. It was definitely. I mean, there was yields we saw we haven't seen it before, and just everything went well for it. You know what I mean? So I think that went really well. I think there's some of the exactly as John said, some very, very good crops of winter wheat, and we had some ordinary enough kind of crops of winter wheat. But I said there was what looked well kind of did well. But I said oilseed rape was really the standard. All the rest did well. I mean, oats did quite well actually. We're all down on oats now, very all of a sudden. But as a crop that grew well, it does seem to perform consistently. And I know again it was very the same as John said. We were in the fields very early. We got everything taken out. We got the straw taken out, and we got stubble cultivation done. It was really, really worked for the break crops. I think it was a fantastic year for them. which is what they need. Apart from the yields of beans, that I think that's our big issue at the minute. But I
Yeah.
think our break crops are doing exactly what they should do. They are growing well themselves. Most of them are washing their face, and they're leaving a very good first crop afterwards, whether that be for winter wheat or whatever.
Back in after, yeah.
Mm.
You mentioned earlier, Richie, around disappointing margins, and obviously the grain price wasn't nearly where people thought it was going to be. But given prices all the way throughout the year, was that such a big shock, or should people maybe be looking at it a little bit more throughout the year and thinking about it a bit harder as we're going through the season?
They made it very hard. I mean, I think we have got the if you look at the way grain has been marketed in the last number of years, the green harvest sale is getting more and more prevalent, and and you'd argue about that there's a premium being paid for the green harvest stuff rather than bringing it out and storing it yourself and selling it as yourself over the season, and there's definitely a move away from that over the last number of years. So people have got insulated from keeping an eye on the market, and there was an expectation that at the end of the day the price would move, and I think that's what happened particularly with oats and with beans in store. People were kind of waiting for the price to lift before they started moving them, and all of a sudden did another year's harvest sitting on top of them, and I think I got a very, very bad got very bad rep because of that, but I think the way we're marketing our grain is insulating growers from the realities of the marketplace. That's not a good place to be. And I think we really have to look at that. And I think from people who are buying grain, it makes it difficult for them to run with the marketplace when all the grain has been bought at a particular time and the price is set a month later, and then it's all the one price and the one product sitting in the stores up the winter time. It makes it difficult.
And do you think then that some of the grain buyers should be doing a little bit more in terms of, I don't know, informing or maybe encouraging farmers to, look or get involved in the market a bit earlier during the season?
I think there's a piece to be done there. Definitely think too. I mean, they talk about forward price, and that hasn't worked. And because at the end of the day, it's selling your grain across a weighbridge at 20% moisture has shown over the last number of years to be the best thing to do. Then drying it yourself, taking on the cost and taking on the risk yourself. So I do think there's a piece there. There's a piece, and I think that's affecting our ability to market Irish grain, insofar as that doesn't insulate. People don't really know what their costs are, and they don't really know what their income is until too late in the season. You get a price for your grain in October. So how does that impact on your next year's crop is already in the ground, or at least planned, or your land is taken? There's a disconnect going on there. I think there's a piece that has to be worked on there. I think maybe it's the merchants, I don't know, but someone has to do that, or maybe come together. But there has to be a piece working that to try and get the market feedback on the ground and being impacted upon.
I suppose, John, given what Richie's after saying there a second ago, I mean, farmers didn't potentially get a price until some of the crops are already in the ground, and obviously with the likes of oilseed rape gone in the ground maybe 2 months. But despite the lower margins, John, there seems to be a lot of crops gone back into the ground again.
We as farmers, that's what we do, and you can't wait for the weather. You have to make your moves when the weather is suitable, and everybody has long-term rotational plans, so you have to stick with the plan. I agree with what Richie says. There is a disconnect between Irish prices and the real market, and you've merchants trying to do the right thing for the grower, trying to support the market, but it does make the end marketing of grain into the open market difficult. But yeah, sowings are well up again, and that's weather driven. I suppose there is a background awareness that malting contracts will be reduced next spring. So where growers had the opportunity, they put in some winter crops to replace what they perceive might be reduced in the spring. But crops went in good conditions, and yourself, probably the most common place that a winter crop will go wrong is in establishment, and where crops went in good conditions, they've established really well, generally speaking. And that's true of winter oilseed rape and the cereals. So the area is well up, and which is good for everybody, really. It spreads the work, and when the spring comes as well.
I just wanted to ask a question, a final question to both of you, maybe in turn, and maybe I'll come to Richie, you first. Is there 2 or 3 lessons that maybe you have learned from the season, or maybe on the other side of it, that farmers should maybe learn from the season?
I think in a good ground season, there's little to be learned, to be honest with you. I think we know what we need to do. I think we are. There was a question you asked John. Actually, don't think you know to me about the use of slurries. There was the early March did allow a good bit of, say, pig slurries on top of unemerged wheat crops. Well established wheat crops, and I think that worked quite well. The year suited. Another year you wouldn't go near it, but I think that lesson of getting organic manures onto crops is where we're at. I mean, it brings an awful lot more over and above what the nutrient value is, but nutrient value in itself is bringing something to the party, and I think really that's where we really have to focus on. I think our rotations are improving. We have some very good rotations in place, and it's anyone that's anyway serious that has a decent rotation in place, and that's to the good, and we just have to keep at that. And as John said, you can't react to the market really when you have a good rotation, because there's no point in breaking your rotation for the sake of a margin on a particular crop, and if so that there's a big decision to be made. But I think it's I suppose it's a matter of sticking to the basics, and I think as John said there a minute ago, farmers are doing that because they're putting more grain into the ground, and they're hoping to say that the markets will react on whatever. So it's a matter of keeping on top of that. But I do think the lesson with organics is there. And it has to be it's not a very sexy, it's not a very new idea, it's not a very magic moment, but putting we're importing 5 million tonne of concentrates, and if you look at that 5 kilograms a tonne, that's 25,000 tonne of phosphorus being brought in here alone. That's put onto index 2, so in index 1, index 2, tillage size is exactly where it should be going. And I think that's where it should be consistently pushed.
John, same question to you.
Well, the first one would be one I mentioned a while ago was certainly seedbed fertilizer for spring crops. I don't think it's ever the wrong thing to do, and it can be a very important thing to do, particularly in a year like the year gone by where we hit dry weather. So I don't think you can put too much fertilizer in the seedbed of spring crops, because you're heading into a time of the year where growth needs to happen, and rain can get scarce at times. So that's one. The second one, certainly, and not for the first time, there was a dramatic difference in winter barley crops, depending whether they were after a break crop or whether they were not. And it was dramatic. Like our national average yield of winter barley is probably something in the region of 3.3 to 3.5 tonnes per acre. Whereas winter barley after a break crop, it's almost like a different crop in terms of its yield potential. And I've seen it in many years, winter barley touching 5 tonne an acre when grown after a break crop with less nitrogen input. So that's something that we need to think more about. I think putting winter barley into a continuous cereal situation, it's not a recipe for a margin anyway, in my opinion. They're the two certainly lessons I saw again this year. That's
brilliant. It's a great roundup of the year. We're not quite finished yet, but pretty much, I suppose, in terms of the year so far. So listen, thanks very much for your thoughts on the subject, and hopefully I'll chat to you again next year.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Michael.
So that's it for today, and a huge thanks to John and Richard for joining me today. So finally then, if you enjoyed the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague, and as always, rate, review and follow on Apple or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy, thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.